Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of social division. I am always excited about the guests that I get to have on this podcast, and it feels like this tremendous honor to read beautiful books and listen and engage in conversation with this world of ideas and practical life and around all of these topics of race and disability and class and justice and healing. I love it so much every week, but this week is so near and dear to my heart because I am talking, and I'm so excited to introduce you to Sara Hendren. Sara is a professor, she's a designer, she is such an interesting and thoughtful academic person, but she's also the mom of a child with Down syndrome who is really right the same age as our daughter Penny. And so we also have that in common. And talking with her about design and disability and Down syndrome and reimagining the world, it just brought me great joy. There was one quotation that I meant to mention in the episode and I didn't get a chance, so I'm just going to quote her now. And it will give you a taste of the depth of insight that you're about to receive from listening to what Sara has to say about how we imagine the world. So this comes towards the end of her new book, which I highly recommend. It's called What Can a Body Do? And she's writing about her son, Graham, who has Down syndrome. She's writing about the clock as a measure of time that also has become a measure of our economic value and productive value in society. And she writes, "The clock may be every bit as much the culprit in the mismatch between a life like Graham's and the world, not simply his genetic status. I see it clearly now, the clock that is, exactly as it is, a monolith that encompasses all of us, a mechanized, utilitarian, ultimately impoverished scale for human value. My son doesn't need a gentle and pacifying form of inclusion. Inclusion is necessary, but it will never be sufficient. He needs a world with a robust, countervailing understanding of personhood and contribution and community in it. Human values that are alive and operational outside the logic of the market and the insistent clock. He needs it, and so do the rest of us." Amen to that. I just love the way in which Sara is able to talk about mutuality, talk about common humanity, and at the same time, not make everyone the same. So I am certain that you will join me in enjoying Sara's perspective as we talk together. Thanks so much for being here today. Well, hello, everyone. My guest today is Sara Hendren. She is the author of this newly released and spectacular book called What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. And we're going to talk all about the book and the title and so many other cool things. I'm thrilled, Sara, to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So I'm going to begin by saying, I wish that there were 10 more chapters in this book. Like it was a book where I just wanted more because every page I felt like I learned something that was like quirky and interesting, but also relevant. And that shifted my thinking and the way I saw the world. And I just wanted that experience to keep going. At the same time, I'm really glad that you finished the book. And obviously, if you'd kept writing it, I would not have gotten the chance to read it. So I'm also glad for that and for the fact that even in this short conversation, I think listeners will get a taste of it. But I'm going to say this on the front end. So I hope that in the next 45 minutes or so, people are going to hear some of the really neat stories, but also applications that you have in this book. And they might think, oh, great, I learned some stuff. I don't need to read the book now. And that's sometimes true. I sometimes feel like all I need is the podcast version. I do not think that is true in the case of your book, because there's way too much really rich and insightful material. So I'm just going to say on the front end, I'm going to front load that if this even like begins to spark your interest as a listener, then you should buy the book and read it. It is called What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. It's by Sara Hendren. We're going to put all those in the show notes, but I just want to underline that. So, all right, Sara, you are an artist. You're a teacher for engineering students. You're a mother. And I was thinking about how those threads of your identity and existence come together in this book. So I thought that might be a good way to introduce you as well as what you've written to tell us, what is the book about? How did it come to be out of who you are?
Yeah, thank you. That's such a good question. And it is true. It's kind of kind of outsider, insider, translation-y kind of book in a number of directions. So I am trained in the arts and humanities entirely, and I teach kind of disability studies, but in an engineering context and in a design studio. So I find myself as like a productive kind of misfit in my kind of day-to-day work life. And I do find that so productive. So day in and day out, I'm a professor at Olin College of Engineering, which is outside Boston. It's a tiny little kind of laboratory experimental school for engineering. And we have students building things from day one. And we think a lot about engineering as it's applied science, right? Meaning it builds stuff that lands in people's lives. Fundamentally, it is not bench science. It is stuff that goes out to the world. So that means it has to involve people from the beginning.
Yeah.
For a number of years, I have taught what engineers think is assistive technology. So they think of it in this very technical sense of kind of prosthetic limbs and sort of, high-tech braille and those kinds of affiliations that they have with where technology meets disability. But I use that laboratory and studio setting to actually have students meet people who would call themselves disabled people, disabled not by the shape of their bodies, but by their interactions with the world that isn't a fit for them. And I set up that encounter in the laboratory to try to actually help students turn their attention away for a bit from the shininess of the technology and its promises, and instead to pay attention to people and their bodies and what they have to say, their needs, yes, but also their wishes. So at the beginning of the book, which is about design and disability, but really about how all our bodies meet the world, we drop in on that laboratory just to set the stage, and we meet a woman named Amanda, who is a little person. So she's around 4 feet tall. And she came to my laboratory in need of a lectern for short stature. So you can imagine, right, that Amanda, as a little person, doesn't fit the standard, just design of the world. So when she walks into my classroom, we're thinking about the heights of the tables and the chairs and the light switches. And this was in the context, again, of an assistive technology class, but it was doing that. This request from Amanda was not for a kind of like, what's a rescue tool for me? But instead, it was this very singular request for a lectern, a piece of furniture that was absolutely bespoke, just for her at her scale. She was asking us, in other words, to make the world actually come toward her a little bit rather than make her taller. So we built a collapsible portable lectern that she can travel with when she gives talks. She's an art historian and a curator by profession, so she needed one of these. And so students built this very clever, folds out in 3 moves lectern out of carbon fiber, which is like got a super high strength to weight ratio. So it's really lightweight, but very strong. And in the process of that encounter, students, right, are undoing their ideas about normalcy. They're undoing their ideas about who's looking to be rescued, right, by technology, as opposed to, and they're undoing their ideas about Amanda's own role in her own life, and her capacity to say, I would like the world to be a little different, not I'm looking for some assistance from some engineers. So that is a frame for the book that then explores all the ways that lots of bodies meet the built world in what Rosemary Garland Thompson, who's a disability scholar, calls a misfit. She says disability is no more and no less than being a square peg in a round hole. When you think about that, that's quite profound, because what that means is not I have a property of a body that is non-normative. It means my body doesn't fit the dominant shape of the world. So square peg and round hole means the misfit friction is actually running both ways.
Right.
It's not clear whether the body needs to come a little bit more smoothly to the world or whether the world actually needs to elasticize and bend some of its structures.
Right.
So this is a really productive question for me in this laboratory. And again, it sets out this book looking at limbs, but also at furniture and also rooms and also streets. I wrote it to expand in its scale that way, misfitting. But I will also say that I went on this whole trajectory, being an artist who lands in an engineering school, which no one could have told me even 10 years ago would happen. But the catalyst for that was my son's birth. So Graham had Down syndrome, and that's how I know you, Amy Julia.
Right.
So we both have teenagers now with Down syndrome, right? So
yeah, they're almost exactly the same age.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Penny was 2005, and I think Graham was born in 2006.
Yeah, January 2006. So they're really
close. Penny's December 2005. They're like a month apart. I didn't even know that. Okay.
Yeah. So that was, for me, I know for you, just this absolute powerful reorganization of how the world works, right? Who who counts and who's normal, and the misfitting that I didn't have language for, of course, when Graham
Right.
was born, but that I, learned in a decade of study since then, that misfitting is both deeply, deeply creative and adaptive, and also an urgent matter of politics. And I find actually that people miss one or the other. They can even think that the politics of disability is very real, but they don't think of the creativity and the adaptation. So I want to just not speak too long right now because I'd rather have an exchange, but just to say the book is driven from those engines, this kind of like, where does art and the question asking of art arrive in the engineering laboratory, and how does familial attachment, and those relationships actually drive also what we do with our lives. Anyway, so.
No, I know. And you could tell I love the perspective you're able to bring in terms of this real lived experience in your own family that has, I think, informed and shaped some of the questions you're asking. But at the same time, I think you're also really clear that like having a child with Down syndrome is not the same as being a little person, is not the same as, you've traveled all over the world to investigate and explore and imagine. I mean, what I love is just that creative, the role. I don't even know if you use the word imagination, but I just thought about the way in which the imagination is so at work, and you're prompting that in your students and in your readers. It was really beautiful. And I'd love to have you just from the get-go, because as you said, so much of this book is about framework. So I love the square peg and round hole in terms of, wait, which one of these is wrong? Like, that's kind of how we're almost taught to think about this, is like one of these. And it's like, well, what if the square peg is supposed to be square and the round hole is supposed to be round, and we're going to fit together somehow? Like, what would that mean? So I love that question. But could you, within that, you mentioned in your book, like 2 different models that disability studies identifies. And I'd love to just hear what those models are, as well as some examples that help. I know when I first had Penny in my life, it was literally as if I was in one of those, I don't know, those 3D pictures where you're trying to see like the dolphins that are, flying out of the water, but you can only see the water. And then when you see it, you're like, how could I not have seen that all along? I feel that way when I'm thinking about disability from these 2 different frames of reference. And I'm sure that's true for many of our listeners. So I'd love for you just to explain those reference points and then give some examples to help us really dig in.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I should say, my book is written kind of for a non-expert reader who might be thinking that disability is not part of their lives right now. And it is a kind of invitation to be thinking about disability as a natural form of, human variation that will arrive in your life at some point, just by the aging process. But probably, if people are thinking about this right now, just thinking about your near circles and loved ones, so people with conditions of misfitting like chronic depression, but also, right, having a broken arm for 2 months out of, in some given year, to things like parents who are thinking about a new diagnosis that's difficult to pin down right now. Let me just invite all of that to be part of the text of this conversation in case people are not seeing the connections. They really are there. Disability is in every life. And so disability studies is this field of academic research that I try to just translate in very layperson's terms, this rich, repository of wisdom, including naming a medical model of disability and then distinguishing a social model of disability. In a medical model, this is very sort of natural to us probably, that, you live with a body that maybe has an impairment, we would call it, maybe in past you might have called it a handicap, or some kind of non-normativity. So, you don't hear with your ears or you don't see with your eyes. But in a medical model, it's purely those things. They are biological facts for sure. But if you think only of disability as a medical model, then you think, well, that's that person's problem. And it's their kind of job to figure out how to, quote, overcome it or to see the right doctors or whatever. But it lives just on a body. And in the social model of disability, the invitation is just to widen the lens a little bit. So if you think right now about somebody in your life who may use a wheelchair temporarily or long-term, some of the time, all the time, folks that I know, my friends who use wheelchairs would say, I'm a disabled person, but they would say, I'm not disabled because my legs don't ambulate and walk down the street. I'm disabled actually because I live in a world built with stairs in it, which is an arbitrary architectural choice, right? That didn't have to be that way, but that has a disabling effect on my body. That doesn't mean, of course, that my legs don't have biological conditions. Of course, all that's very real. But it's to say, when you widen that lens, and I'm just expanding my hands out from my body right now. What that means is disability lives between this body and this desk in front of me, and between my body and the computer, and between my body and the chair. So that's that square peg round hole thing where you go, oh my goodness, well, is it that we need a better wheelchair or better medicine for that wheelchair user? Or is it that the ramp might be something that's needed for that building, right, as an alternate form of access?
Yeah.
And when changing that question then changes your utter mental model of the world, right? Suddenly now you're thinking about the sizes of your doors and their thresholds, and you're thinking about how easy or hard it is. Some of your listeners are thinking about, how easy or hard it is to manipulate kitchen tools, right? Or how easy or hard it is to type on an ordinary computer, or to walk long distances with or without a cane. What could the world's shapes and structures be like that made that a little bit more friendly? And we see, of course, examples of this all the time now. So I tell in the book the story of how curb cuts came to every city corner in the United States and lots of other places around the world. And so curb cuts, right, are just the diagonal cut that goes between the corner of a sidewalk and the street, so that you can go down in that smooth passage,
Yep.
as opposed to bumping one step down. And people forget that this is actually a very new thing in the built environment, right? It's a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was in 1990. That's an anti-discrimination law that has in it an architectural code, because it's sort of, right, the idea that actually bias and discrimination might be in our very hardware, in our concrete, in our steel, like in our actual structures. And so think about how improbable that was, that law said, no, you're going to go around to every corner and cut that, that diagonal. I mean, it's unfathomable. And yet that's profound, right? So now if you're a wheelchair user, you can get down the street, but not just down the street. It means you can get to the voting booth and to your place and to your school. So we have actually asked the built environment to flex and bend. And some of your readers or your listeners may be thinking about, maybe they use speech to text on their phone. I know lots of people who don't have the dexterity to type. It's just built in on your smartphone. You don't have to be tutored in how to do it. It's a built-in, intuitive kind of feature. A lot of your listeners probably watch TV with captions on, even though they're hearing people. That was also the work of deaf advocates, TV watchers, who insisted that all standard televisions come with closed captioning as a built part of the technology and not as an extra appendage. And we don't even think about it now,
Right. Well, and there are benefits to not only the people who are specifically advocating for it from some position of disability, but actually, I mean, as a, mom who has pushed a stroller, and even, not to mention the fact, as someone who would like to, I can walk on my two legs, and I'd like to be able for my friends and relatives who use wheelchairs to be with me. Like, I'd like to be together in that, right? And so there are all sorts of applications and implications socially from considering a social model of disability. I was struck by a couple of things that I just noted in reading. One was when you're talking about the deaf community, you note the difference just in the term hearing loss and deaf gain. Could you say a little bit about that? Because I thought that kind of encapsulated this medical model, right, of hearing loss and social model of understanding disability in terms of the words deaf gain, which for some listeners might not even make sense without some explanation.
Yeah. So, that's a beautiful sort of example of shifting from and just expanding from a medical model of disability to a social one, because it gets us better questions about the world we all want. There's a chapter called Room that opens at Gallaudet University, and Gallaudet is an all-deaf and hard of hearing campus in Washington, D.C., chartered by Abraham Lincoln, actually in the 1860s, around a long time. Yeah. And there are all kinds of clever architectural adaptations to deafness on Gallaudet's campus. So there used to be a somatic doorbell there. So a visitor would approach a building and would pull a chain, and a stone would drop that would register by, the vibration of that, instead of a sound. It's really clever. And right now, if you go and you're going to knock on somebody's office door, you flip the light switches off and on. They're all outside, the doorway. So there's really clever things like that all the time. But a dozen years ago or so, an architect named Hansel Baumann, who was the architect on campus, and then a bunch of deaf students, Gallaudet students and alums and faculty, got together to say, what would a new architecture look like that's actually wrapped around the condition of deafness? Because remember that Gallaudet is not interested in curing deafness in promotion of hearing. It is a proudly signing community that's also bilingual and uses English as one of its languages, but it's primarily a signing community. And it is a deep celebration of the integrity of deaf experience and of ASL as a beautiful visual spatial language. So the result of that architectural research was to come up with, like, I think 100 design principles that became what's known as deaf space. So it was an idea that actually the shape of the room could actually be modified such or thought about ahead of time to actually honor all the ways that ASL plays out as a spatial language, but is also like a way of being. So I'll give you some examples. In a lobby there of a dorm, a deaf space dorm, you've got a long open lobby with these little pods of rooms for meeting, and each of those pods has a half height wall, because you don't need full height walls for sound barriers there, right? Actually long sight lines to communicate across distances. And the materials are made out of wood, which has a nice strong resonance, because you might tap or slap to feel that somatic signal again, to call a group to order, for example. And the upholstery and the walls are always in solid colors, greens and blues, because they provide the best kind of contrast for the intricate, like the little gestures of sign that you're doing, right? So you don't want a big pattern, you don't want that glare of harsh white. So and things like the doorways are extra wide, the sort of double doors, because you can think about how the distance between you and a person, if you're signing to them and also looking to them, there are doors that open up at the same time for you, so that kind of extra berth. And there are corners that wrap around in a curve rather than meeting at a hard 90-degree angle, right? Because if you're listening for footsteps, then you can avoid a crash. But if you can't steps, this kind of solid curve around. And the most fascinating thing was actually going in the neighborhood of Gallaudet to the signing Starbucks, which is nothing more and nothing less than a regular Starbucks, recognizable as such, but with all deaf staff behind the counter. And I went in there as a hearing person, and I didn't need any instructions at all about how to behave there. They had the kind of quick wipe electronic tablets to write my name and my order down. And then, of course, all the payment is automated, as it is everywhere with credit cards and such. And we gestured and looked at one another, but no one made an attempt to voice, and I did not make an attempt to sign. We had an exchange, right? Silent one. And then my name came up on a monitor down the counter. And just think about how you've switched the dynamics utterly with very low tech actually moves. It's really interesting.
Well, and what makes that last example makes me think about is, and back to, kind of the question implicit in, I guess you actually name this in your book at one point. You say, who is the world built for? And in that case, on the one hand, you could say that Starbucks is built for the deaf students from Gallaudet and who are in that community, and yet you still belonged there. It wasn't as though you were excluded from that space in how they had been able to welcome you into it. And I think, again, for those of us who are in this kind of able-bodied neurotypical, which, is the predominant set of spaces, certainly how we think most of the time and in our institutions, for us to try to be doing that question of who belongs here and why, who have we built this space for, and the space certainly in these physical and architectural ways, but also, and I think you get at this in the ways in which we are designed to greet one another and to think about one another, right? I mean, just again, language, attitude. You, in the book, you have an example of someone who was starting out as a college in California. Anyway, the headline was "Helpless Cripple Attends UC Classes Here in Wheelchair." And you're like, oh my gosh, the story of this man.
Yeah, that's right.
And that he's being called a helpless cripple, like it is almost a satire now. And yet clearly that was the perception, which on some level is still carried. And so I think that sense of like, how do we think about belonging, and how do our spaces and our interactions change when we start imagining it differently, is a lot of what gets prompted by reading about places like Gallaudet and what they've done there. And it's go ahead.
I just, it's not a call to say to remake the world in the bespoke shape for each of us, right? It's not that. And I think, just shifting the who's behind the counter at the Starbucks, is just a way to see one another better, right? It's just a way to shift the dynamic so that deaf folks are not always coming to the hearing world and saying like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to do all of the, writing down myself, like I'm going to take on all that work, but to let that redesign be a kind of opening to our wonder, our wonder about how different people are having an alternate sensory experience of the world and have a beautiful alternate way of communicating, and that a Starbucks of all things could be a mix of the public sphere, that like it was half hearing people and half voicing people and hearing people and half deaf folks in that space. But we were mixed in the public sphere in a way that not often the case. So sorry, go ahead.
No, very cool. I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, you've mentioned the words normal a couple of times, and then you talk about where that idea of even the norm came from. And then later on, you write about the idea of average, which I also found so fascinating. So I would love to hear a little bit of like, what's the history of the idea of normal and the idea of average, and how have those things played themselves out in our built environments?
Yeah, for sure. So normalcy, certainly for kind of industrial cultures that operating on high technology and market economies like ours in the U.S., are built on normalcy as a product of social sciences. And so we think of normal and percentiles and standards that are we talk about in terms of normalcy as like eternal and inherited, but really they're just about a couple centuries old. So the social sciences are kind of an early 19th century way of applying scientific counting and tabulating and comparisons taken from the natural sciences and applied to social characteristics. So that's how we measure populations at scale. It's how we describe the behavior of groups. It's how we quantify, the features of the body, that kind of thing. And so, statistics, of course, are useful to us, right? And in sociology and social sciences, we need actually to understand populations at scale. We need to understand group behavior. We are in the middle of a pandemic right now. We need to trace, right, flu transmission and so on. The problem becomes what social scientists call the aggregative fallacy, when we let actually the comparative number, right, where I belong in the group relative to other people, the aggregative fallacy tells you that that's the only thing that matters. So therefore, to just think about if their folks are parents or they were children once in the pediatrician's office, the measurements there are about height and weight and other kinds of features compared to other kids, compared to other babies, right? The way we talk about where we land is always on scale, compared side by side, looking to either side, right? How do I stack up against other people? Again, that's useful for scientists to understand, but when we experience that in the pediatrician's office, it invites us to think about our child or ourselves only in relativity to other people. And so normalcy became this kind of, the standard way that we talk about one another, how we measure up compared to people. And it's a long and complicated history that I'm not doing full justice to. You'd have to really read deeply in the history. But over the course of the 19th century, with kind of misinterpretations of Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest, again, a misinterpretation of that, but taken up. And then this kind of nationalist, regimes around perfecting human populations. It gets really ugly in the early 20th century with what we know as eugenics, right? So that's where normalcy is not just how you generally measure up in the group, but it's like, how do you enhance and actually optimize for that kind of, the achievement, I'm putting it in quotes, of normalcy. And so that got quite, as we know, right, from Nazi Germany and so on, gets quite ugly, right, when we apply it as an ethic or as an ethos for how we got to be. But so maybe that ugly history is mostly behind us, but I do think we feel the long tail of a kind of eugenic way of thinking, sort of soft eugenic way of thinking about one another. And you and I, of course, are in a very particular eugenic politics. It is eugenic, right? That is the culling of populations. I'm the pro-choice mother of a person who is concerned about selective termination. So just to go right to the heart of the issue, we do have the of eugenics with us. And people sort of want to say, like, well, if it's a matter of private choice, then what can be done? I agree that private choice is important, and yet many private choices at a time. We are making choices right now about who is worthy to arrive on the planet.
Yeah. And I mean, to that point, which I'm glad you raise in the book as well, there is this sense of every private choice is made in the context of a social environment.
That's right.
And so, sure, we can point fingers at individuals who make private choices that we disagree with and say that's discriminatory, right? Or what, but that to me is almost beside the point
Right.
in terms of what does it mean for our world, our built world, but also our felt world, right? Our social and emotional world to be a place where when women are looking at a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome, instead of thinking in only negative medical and negative social terms, they can think in terms of possibilities and opportunities. And I
Yeah.
think I'm skipping ahead a little bit and maybe we'll get back to this, but at the end of the book, when you write about Graham a little more specifically and about the idea of the clock
Yeah.
and the ways in which we have started to let time and productivity within time be a shorthand of valuing people. And so
Yeah.
I do think that sense of the ways in which we value one another coming out in even just the assumption that every woman would do some form of prenatal testing and have a choice about whether or not, even with a wanted pregnancy, it's going to continue. So I'm with you. I think those questions are really tricky, but at the same time, really important to keep saying, hey guys, remember eugenics?
Yeah.
And
Right.
remember also, even just the sense that there was this history of people with disabilities, Down syndrome specifically, who were sent to institutions. And I
Right.
think we tend to talk about that as this horrific time. And it's like, well, guess what families don't have people with Down syndrome now? Like this keeps
Right.
moving in much the same way that I think when we think about race in America, we move from enslavement to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. It's like we just keep switching the way we're going to try to control these bodies out of quote unquote the norm, as opposed to saying, what does it mean to actually expand our
That's right.
welcome so
Yeah.
that everyone is changed by that? And
That's right.
that, I think there's real parallels. They're not the same thing, but there's some parallels there that are important. And yeah, glad you
Absolutely.
bring it up.
And well, right back at you. And I will say, just to go back to that original spirit of your question, and we could talk a lot about Down syndrome further if you like, but just to go back to like the legacy of normal and the average,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that the world built of stairs, the world built of sidewalks with no curb cuts, all of those things bear out a very tacit, not probably witting or unwitting, right? But bear out this presumption about who's going to be in public space. And anyone who has approached a big courthouse or a big, government building with, 30 stairs, you think like, no one who ever held the hand of a toddler learning to walk, right, thought that this was on the team of architects, right? Definitely the best. No one accompanying their aging parent, right, who could slip easily on the ice, was thinking about this kind of use case of the city.
Right.
And that, so when you look around, you can see that so much of what's been designed has been by sort of ambulatory and physically strong men designing for other men, and not with a built environment that works a little more flexibly for conditions of interdependence, for conditions of assistance, and certainly not for conditions of non-normative bodies. And yet, what I'm showing in the book is that the built world, again, has been remade in so many ways. I mean, think about the kneeling bus, like just
Mm-hmm.
letting out of air, in 6 inches down where the bus comes down to you to get on if you're an older adult, using a cane, if you're a wheelchair user. In my own city in Cambridge, the Women's Center, once those kneeling buses came out, the Women's Center lobbied to have it made policy that you would also kneel the bus for a stroller. So all of those are just these ways of, thinking about the built environment in ways that it can be remade, actually, in the service of a more desirable world. And I point to those examples as much as I sort of say, wow, this legacy of normal is something to continue to be worried about. The shining points of light throughout the book in design are an index of our ideas about each other and about the way those ideas can change. I mean, it's just
Mm.
remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about also the difference. between universal design and the more bespoke, and I don't know that you have a name for that design, like individualized design or these different, because there's these various things like the kneeling bus or the curb cuts or ramps. I mean, any number of things that actually enhance the experience of the built world for many, many people, not just people who we would say, oh, disabled person, but in various ways. I want to ask you about the difference between universal design and more individualized design or bespoke design, and the advantages and disadvantages. And I don't know if disadvantages is even the right word, but just what are those two things, and why would we think in one term or the other, or one frame?
Yeah, and universal design, so those examples of curb cuts and closed captioning, if people are using OXO, Good Grips, kitchen tools, if you're participating in those universal design stories, and they tend to, yes, they tend to go out at scale, they tend to be kind of, quote, for everyone, but so we should be celebrating those things, and I do in the book, but there's so much more, there's so many more ways in which we can look at the particular ways that people tinkering in their own living rooms, people doing very localized kind of work, and people doing in the 21st century what's sometimes called diffuse design, so networked practices, little local practices that can be shared online. We don't actually have to think at that scale. So you build a widget that then only matters if 100,000 people use it or 1 million people use it. I also think, just from a civil rights perspective, universal design works in a market economy, and again, we can be happy about a good kitchen tool that arrives for under $10 at the big box store.
Yes.
But what's the right thing to do? It's to build a democracy that actually has flexibility in it, because that's what a democracy does. In other words, we can't have a designed world that only rationalizes itself if it benefits everyone, quote unquote. You see what I mean?
I do, yeah. And I appreciate that point. Like, I'm thinking about how often I have almost felt like I'm able to make a case for, whether it's a word like inclusion or something like a curb cut, where it's like, look, this is good for me as a mom with a stroller, as opposed to, wouldn't I just want, especially in a society that does have the means, wouldn't I want someone who uses a wheelchair to be able to get to work?
Yes.
Like, why would I not want that? Even if it does not, it does benefit me, but even if it does not directly benefit me. And that is a more universal design situation. But I just think that one of the quotations I was really struck by, and I think you're quoting another scholar, but you wrote that some scholars claim, I'm quoting here, that the fundamental aspect of human embodiment is disability. And I am curious about this sense of disability as what it made me wonder is disability the way in which our common humanity is displayed, more so than in what we would tend to think like, oh, normal or average, as opposed to disability as what is common about us in our humanity. And I think especially of the vulnerable and interdependent aspects of our humanity. So I don't know what that prompts in you, but I'd love to hear what you think.
Yes. Thank you for that question, because it is so foundational. And I find even people who can come along and say, oh, yes, we need an accessible world, tend to avoid seeing their own connection, right, to this profound idea of being interdependent. Because, right, think about it. What is the ground of how we know a human is, right? Would we say it's cognition? I think we wouldn't want to go there quite, right? We wouldn't want to say it's higher thinking or abstract reasoning, right? You cut out a whole lot of people when you do that. So philosophers have lots of arguments about this, but those scholars, Brenda Brueggemann, Sharon Snyder, and Rosemary Garland Thompson, were saying, alongside lots of other scholars in disability studies, that it is our need for one another. So we enter our lives acutely dependent on other people. We often exit our lives also in a period of dependence, and all in between, we traffic in and out of experiences of needing one another, and that actually it's loneliness and depression in old age, right? That gets people, that has really poor outcomes associated with it. And so much of our ideas about our own mythology about how we don't need people very much, or our own sense of autonomy and independence, we know that actually what makes us flourish is connection.
Right.
That is the giving and the receiving of power. Right. And so you might say even that disability is no more and no less than personal and political needfulness. We could actually let that be visible and unifying, right? Without romanticizing it, right? There are conditions that are disabling that we would want a cure for tomorrow. So it's no accident that this whole discussion that you're describing comes at the end of the Room chapter with the discussion of Steve Sailing, who has advanced ALS,
Right.
and who, upon getting a diagnosis a dozen years ago, went about the project of designing an independent, a living space for himself and a number of other people with ALS and MS. And I describe in there the Sailing House residence, which is on a technological level, from an independence standpoint, is quite remarkable. So Steve has a little cursor on the bridge of the glasses on his, the nose bridge on his glasses that talks to a wheelchair mounted tablet that allows him to open all the doors and to summon the elevators and to run the media and the HVAC and stuff in his room, which is a beautifully designed space funded by philanthropy and Medicaid here in Boston. And the thing that ALS really troubles us, right? Because it is a restriction of mobility that is a really hard diagnosis, and his body has very little mobility in it now. And I try to invite the reader to look at Steve's life, to marvel at that technology, to marvel even more at the ecosystem of care in which he lives his life, and to hold two things together that can both be true. One is that he would want a cure for ALS tomorrow. We all would rejoice. And that a life worth living can be built. Like, those things can both be. And Steve would say that in the absence of pharmacology, that technology is the cure. And I never stopped sort of thinking about that, the mystery of it. But it's the technology is the cure for making his life convivial, right, with other people, right? There's not this mythology that somehow he is escaping the difficulty. So in other words, when they say that disability might be the fundamental aspect of being human, that's quite a provocation, because it is the invitation to think of our own needs as really just fundamental to our survival. And so we can spend our lives rushing away from it, or subtly discriminating, sort of distinguishing ourselves from those of others and thinking, oh, how lucky we are, and all that's just noise. That is noise, right? Or we could just say, I belong on that planet too. I have a body that has needs, right? And so that's a marvelous thing, and distinctive and varied between us. We're not the same, but we share that. I mean, it's just a profound idea that I learned from disability studies.
Yeah, and me too. I think I have been trained in how to hide my humanity in being trained in how to become more of an individual, more of a productive, efficient achiever, more of an isolated human. And in really asking that same question for me from a theological perspective, because I was in seminary when Penny was born, but similarly being like, well, wait a second. Theologians have said being made in the image of God is the ability to reason. I mean, all those same things that philosophers have said, right? And so what if being made in the image of God is the capacity to give and receive love?
Yeah.
If God is love, what if that's what it means to be human? What if that means, and so how does that actually change my understanding of the deepest aspect of my humanity, and the ways in which Penny might actually have access to that is somehow easier because her needs are so much more acknowledged by our society, obviously sometimes in a very dismissive way. But that to me has been a gift, because it has slowly opened my own heart to my own needs and those of others, not as shameful things that should be cured, but actually as the ways in which we can begin to relate to one another with love and care. So I really resonated just with that thought of disability as actually fundamental to our humanity.
Yeah.
And even for those of us who would, not be diagnosable as people with disabilities, and yet who nevertheless find ourselves as needy creatures in, potential relationships of care. I have a couple more questions to ask you. And one is just, okay, so in all of these conversations, I think it's really easy to imagine the cynic who says, okay, if we're thinking about addressing these needs that are not the mainstream, predominant majority culture needs, won't it just cost too much? Like, just from a very practical, the money, it's like, are taxes all going to go up in order for this to happen better? Like, on a political level, on a social level, that all sounds wonderful, but shouldn't we be doing more good for more people rather than designing for individual needs or for minute portions of the population who need more? So I would love to just hear how you respond. And I'm thinking especially about your chapter on time in talking about the value system of our economic life in terms of what we value and what it costs in actual dollars and perhaps in other ways as well.
Yeah, well, wow, so many things. I mean, listeners will find if you read the book, you will see just as many quite low tech and affordable designs that people are working on that have a profound impact on their lives. So little $10 objects and also low tech practices that are so nimbly and cleverly done and distributed for free. There's a whole profile of a low tech prosthesis set of clinics in India called the Jaipur Foot Organization that gives away lower leg prostheses for free. So we can find ingenuity, we can find innovation truly everywhere.
Well, and I'm just going to interrupt for a second because you also give the example of, I think it's a woman with a prosthetic arm where it's like, actually the like Velcro and the rubber band is what I need. And I'm sorry if it makes you uncomfortable. I mean, I'm not really sorry, but like it might make you uncomfortable that you don't see an arm where you think you're supposed to, but this is what actually allows me to function in the world. And
right. That's right.
So anyway, that's an aside, but it was a great example.
Yeah. And so people, I think I also, in the chair chapter, profile a workshop in Manhattan that builds low-tech cardboard carpentry furniture for kids with disabilities all over New York with the most just stunningly, inventive materials. And the thing that the director there said to me that I think is relevant here, that I never forgot, is she said, there will always be people who have needs for adaptations. And remember, right, if you're thinking this about the cost issue that you just named, each of us, our bodies can change tomorrow, right? So we want a world with some of that safety net in it. But she said, like, the world will always have people who have needs and misfits. The world will also actually always have very inventive tinkerers in their garages and living rooms, and also high-tech laboratories doing really amazing stuff. She said, actually, what's in short supply, I just think this is amazing, is the person in the middle who's willing to ask for something different than is already on offer. Like the person who understands that the status quo doesn't have to be accepted and that something else might get born. So I'm thinking, for example, Amy, Julia, of the Dementia Village in Weesp, the Netherlands, which was a regular nursing home. So think of a nursing home with a long bay, corridor, memory care, so extra locked facility of a nursing home. And the board of directors there 20 years ago or something looked around and just thought, if we develop dementia, is this the place that we want to live? This is that status quo moment, right? Will we say it's regrettable, but it can't be helped? Or will we say, could it be otherwise, right? And the answer was clearly no. And they developed a set of priorities, like what are the things that we value? And one of many was what they call favorable surroundings. And for them, that meant engaging with an architecture firm and building a model village, a simulacrum of a village as a nursing home. So it's got streets and shops and a restaurant and a theater. Now, they are under the same kind of state controls and state funding as other nursing homes that look like those standard issue nursing homes. So that's not something where they do actually cleverly raise money by having a theater that is both for the residents and also is rentable from the outside. They also have a restaurant there, which is like a porous. It's partly open, partly closed. This is ingenious, right? So folks from the town can come eat at this restaurant, and they just expect that there will be folks wandering in, because wandering is part of dementia, and that everybody will behave in a respectful way, and it works for them. But and in that way, that also maintains a kind of continuity for folks in dementia care, and we can hardly imagine that in this country, right? Not folks not being, just cloistered away. But they do that as partly a fundraising gesture. I guess I'm just saying there's actually good ideas everywhere, truly. And there's actually, right, I tell a couple of examples of like the best that money can buy, the $80,000 universal prosthetic limb. I can think of as many cases where folks didn't make use of those as for those who did. So it's a very American market economy assumption that if you're going to do the best for people, that the best will be expensive and will come, via specialists in high-tech laboratories of science, right? Like that, all of that is such a bundle of assumptions. Rather than thinking like that regular people and enfranchised citizens come together to remake their streets all the time. Think about the ways that bike lanes arise in cities across the United States. It's a lot of times it's biking advocates who go this lane right here, right? And they'll even make a temporary one to show, the kind of proof of concept. That's a subtle reshaping that changes everything in terms of transportation, but doesn't require a huge amount of dollars. So I feel like when folks go there, some things do require dollars. And this, again, you don't have to be a kind of revolutionary about market economies, for example. You can be a revolutionary and think, let's burn it all down and recreate the world. You can actually, though, be quite reformist and think, all I want is an investment in neighborhoods, some good after school care, like not letting folks fall through the cracks, right, who have disabilities, building good, quality transportation. It's actually, that is not such a radical idea,
Well, and that's one of the people I read a lot is a guy named Eric Carter, who thinks a lot about faith communities and architecture. And he's like, yes, of course, don't put your ramp, near the dumpster in terms of like communicating welcome. But there might be a few things that will cost money, but the biggest thing for your faith community to do is change the posture of the heart and mind of the people who are there in terms of what does it mean to welcome what does it mean to welcome this person into my classroom? What does it mean to welcome this person into my sanctuary, into my civic organization, whatever it is? And I think that on the one hand, if we value life, then we can put some dollars behind that as a society. Yeah. But at the same time, let's be clear that the dollars are not what we need as much as we need that human investment in one another in order for this to happen. So I have one final question, which in some ways is probably just me as one mom asking another. I was struck in how you wrote about you wrote about Graham and just the propensity of people to kind of celebrate achievement in two ways. One, in kind of a patronizing, like, oh, look, you gave an example of a guy who like was an adult who had eaten broccoli for the first time and people cheered. And then you also write about, I might even find the quotation. All right, I'm going to read this. Graham helped break us of any instincts to make him into a scripted success story project. An all too common and benign seeming determination to beneficently prove his worth by hoping he might be exemplary among children with Down syndrome, a certain kind of achiever that other people would understand. This is a negotiation every family must work out with clear-eyed assessment. Who is it the child wants to be? And where might the advocacy efforts of parents proceed, wittingly or unwittingly, from what are actually parental needs? Perhaps prescribed ideas about familial success and happiness, rather than from radical acceptance and support. And I similarly find myself wanting to prove Penny's worth in the eyes of our society, sometimes in my own eyes, probably in terms of the parental expectations, but other times where I'm like, I don't really care, but these people do. So you got to, and wanting to prove her worth. And so I'm just curious how you have navigated those boundaries, or how you've seen because certainly you're not only writing from your experience here, but other people navigate those boundaries, and what it means to be in that posture, not only as a parent, but honestly as fellow human beings, of radical acceptance and support.
Yeah, and this is the clock chapter, as you mentioned, and so the other chapters are about objects, and the clock is this conceptual object of time. And the way our kids misfit, right, is not so much about replacement parts or prosthetics or a sensory difference. It's about their misfitting with economic time. It's about their misfitting with non-normative intelligence in not being a kind of economic unit at the end of their education that is recognizable in the culture. And that is, if you think about it, that is the presumption of a lot of education and a lot of hustling that, sort of good parenting looks like, is sort of like, what's the way for my child to sort of best be set up to, quote, compete, right? That's the way a lot of people talk about it. And what they mean is that to be on the clock, right? To be measured in our worth fundamentally as folks who produce at 40 hours a week and pay our taxes and therefore find the ground of our existence, right? I mean, I'm not knocking working 40 hours a week. It's just, is that how you want the entirety of your worth to be housed? So having a kid with Down syndrome, yes, does break you of all that. There are a lot of messages. I wrote and rewrote that passage that you read extensively to try to get the tone right? Because I do feel, I feel quite a lot of anger about the way those stories play out, and about the kind of internalized ableism that a lot of parents can just replicate over and over by saying, my son's not defined by his disability, and here's how well he's doing for a kid with Down syndrome compared to all these other folks, and trying to win over the hearts and minds of folks by his performance. And here again, folks might be like, yeah, that's ugly. We don't want to do that. But what is the ground of human worth, right? If it's not that economic productivity, then what is it? And I would just leave it open as a question. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is a rich and mysterious question. And it's one that Graham, being Graham's mother, has helped me think through in the most incredibly imaginative, sort of wide open way. And it has helped me be a better parent to all my kids. I think all the time now about what is it that I hope he feels at the, in adulthood? What is it that I want to feel from other people? I actually don't want to be designed on the clock either. Mm-hmm. So how can I build the kind of culture that fortifies those other kinds of values? And I don't know, Julia, like it's not like the philosophical resources are that. In theology, you have a rich tradition, right? In global wisdom traditions, you do have alternatives, but widely available, it's fairly thin out there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And yet I think it's fairly deep within us to acknowledge the worth of other human beings, even in misfit bodies and atypical minds. And I think it applies certainly within the realm of disability, but I think about, people who have relatives with dementia, and it's like, but this person who is not the same as my mom 10 years ago is still a person who has dignity and honor, and but I can't measure it anymore in the way I thought I could. Or even I was listening to a man earlier today who talked about prison reform. He's was a corrections officer and now is the head of the prison system in Connecticut, and just talked about, like, do we actually, even the idea of correction, like, we don't believe in incapacitation, which is how we treat most people who go into prison, as opposed to you're a person who potentially could be corrected. And obviously there's some problems with that word too, but even just that sense of what does it mean to believe in people? Right. It means to believe that they have value that matters to all of us, whoever they are. And so I think there are applications there are negative applications for that economic productivity model of worth that come out even in and among the most economically productive of us in terms of how we see ourselves. But then I also think that if we can reframe what it means, and this actually is where I think that the wisdom traditions and religious traditions, if we can actually call from this understanding of humanity, have so much to offer in a world where there is this misfit between what our world tells us is valuable and yet what we intuitively understand about each other. They don't fit together, and we often go with, well, money is how I know how to make it all make sense, so I'll go that way. But right. There's some discord with it all the same.
Or just saying like, well, I'm a realist, like I really wrote this book to try to be as pragmatic and also as imaginative as possible, because I do sense that people will say, well, I'm a realist, I live in the real world, and so therefore I capitulate, to kind of the standard. But I think, and this goes back to your money question, it's like, just ask yourself, in the way that those designers of the Dementia Village did, how do I want to be treated if I'm even a little bit different than I am now? And the way that I treat folks who are currently acutely vulnerable is the logic by which I will be treated, right? So we know that to be true. So I think in the most pragmatic sense, if you're even a basic believer in kind of democratic flourishing, right, that isn't built on absolute power, then sort of brute force, measurements of our worth, then we owe it to each other to be a little more imaginative than we are. And it doesn't take an overhaul of the world, an editing of a lot of what we have already. It makes all the difference.
Well, thank you. I think this book is a wonderful, you said it was both pragmatic and imaginative, and I think that's probably one of the reasons I loved it so much. So thank you for your time and for your wisdom, and I will look forward to returning to your words, and I hope there's more to come.
So good to be here.
Thank you for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. We will be sure to note all of the references in the show notes. And again, as always, but especially this month, which is Down Syndrome Awareness Month, I would love for you to share this episode. I think it would give people who are not within the disability or Down syndrome community a taste of the richness and the depth and the joy that is possible in engaging with the world of people who are aware of what it means to be deeply, fully human. So, in addition to asking you to share this episode, and of course, as always, subscribe to the podcast, give a quick rating or review, please just help people to benefit from these conversations if that's something that you have been able to do yourself. I'm grateful to our co-host, Breaking Ground, to Jake Hansen, our editor, to Amber Beery, my social media coordinator, and to you, my faithful listeners. It's really fun to meet with you week by week, even if only through these words coming, through your phone, through your computer, however you listen to your podcasts. Let's see, next week, who do I get to talk to? Oh, that's right. I get to talk to Kurt Neal and Anne-Marie Kerrigan about the film Normie. And I'm really excited. If you've listened this far, you're getting a real bonus because we are going to make Normie available for viewing. This is a wonderful documentary film that some of you might remember we've talked about here before, and our family is actually featured in the film. So I'm going to talk to Anne-Marie and Kurt about making the film. Anne-Marie is the star, kind of the central character in the film. She's a young woman with Down syndrome who's really coming of age in this movie, and we are going to have that available for viewing from October 20th, I think, until October 31st. So tune back in for more details on that. You can also check me out on social media, but yes, on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, there'll be more details, as well as on my website, amyjuliabecker.com, about that opportunity. As you go into your day today, I do hope and pray that you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.